I'm thrilled to be here today to talk about who I am and some of my thoughts about some broad themes, like you mentioned, related to networking, mentoring, and collaboration. I've had these discussions and these themes have come up in many different places, and I've discussed them with many different people, uh, occasionally throughout my academic career. So I'm excited to share them with you today. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about myself. I was born to a hearing family, and I was born in the Midwest. I know everyone has a different view of what exactly the Midwest is, what its boundaries are, but I was born and raised in Kansas City, first in Missouri, and then my family moved to the Kansas side of Kansas City. And the reason why I explain this, I'll make it a bit more clear here. My family, my parents are from Missouri. My father's family is from the Kansas City area, and my mom's family is from both Kansas City and St. Louis. So I have many relatives around the area of Kansas City and Missouri. I'm not the only deaf person in my family, however. On my mother's side, my maternal grandmother's cousin was deaf, and he was a very important person in my life. We weren't in contact very regularly, but he had a huge impact on my life and my existence and everything about who I am, because all of the older relatives in my family knew him fairly well. My grandmother's cousin was born around the 1930s in the country in Missouri, in a one-room schoolhouse, very rural. He went to school alone. He was the only deaf person there. There were no access services at all. And of course, his mother didn't know what to do with him, being born deaf. And so she tutored him every day, sat with him individually, one-on-one. And he was a schoolboy. He loved school, he loved academics, he loved learning. He went to college and received a degree in engineering, which was an incredible feat at that time. Remember, he had no access services at all. I cannot imagine doing that type of thing today. That really shows a lot about him and his character and drive. But what he contributed to me and to my family is very important. Most hearing people, upon finding out that they have a deaf family member, don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to handle having a deaf person in the family. But because of my grandmother's cousin being deaf, my family had already been exposed to deafness. They already saw it as a positive thing. They never had the attitude that deaf people are dumb or that deaf people can't succeed. My grandmother's cousin was brilliant. He was an engineer. He was completely deaf. He got himself through college, and that was seen as a fairly normal thing. And that sense of normalcy about being deaf was also applied to me when I was born deaf. So the expectation was already there that I could succeed. Of course, school is always important and academics is important, but the expectation was already there that I could be successful. People in my family decided that they weren't sure exactly how to approach me being born deaf, but funny enough, my grandmother's cousin grew up oral. He did not use sign language until he was 33 years old. You know how the Deaf Network works. Someone met him and invited him to a deaf event, a deaf gathering. And so he went to a deaf gathering and happened to meet his future wife there. His future wife grew up in Kansas, going to Kansas School for the Deaf. She was a fluent ASL user. And of course, my grandmother's cousin only used spoken English at that time. But they built a relationship and he learned sign language. And that's a very interesting part of his story, is that he learned sign language when he was a bit older from his wife. So then when I was born deaf, when I was diagnosed as being deaf and all that, immediately my mom reached out and asked what to do about communication. What was the plan for communication? And my mom always said, of course we'll provide communication. Of course my daughter will have access to communication. And that mindset, that attitude about communication and about exactly what would be needed, and the recognition that communication meant language, that my grandfather's cousin and his wife used sign language together, they had successful jobs, they had 4 children, they raised a successful family, and they saw, the other members of my family saw that they used sign language and they were successful, so they automatically thought that I would use sign language as well. My grandparents, aunts and uncles, and my extended family did take sign language classes in the past as well. Now, of course, everyone wasn't fluent sign language users, but they did try to take classes and they did have a rudimentary basic set of ASL skills that they were prepared to use with me because of my grandmother's cousin. So that idea that deaf people can be successful was already rooted in my family when I was born. And deafness seems to have a particular, some sort of rootedness in my mom's side of the family. My mom's brother, my uncle, had dated a deaf woman in college who had graduated from Texas School for the Deaf. My aunt was also in a relationship for many years with a man who had a deaf son. So something about deafness is entangled in my mother's side of the family. We were all familiar with deafness when I was born. And that could be a whole other topic of conversation, a whole other lecture that I could give. But either way, I want to set the stage for the familiarity that my mother's side of the family had with deafness when I was born. Most deaf people who are born to a hearing family have a much different experience than I did. My mom has also explained about my school experience. This is really my mother's narrative and not necessarily mine about which school I went to and why I went to that school. Now, back in my time, the schooling option was important to my parents, but it was a very difficult decision. They were not sure where to send me to get the best education possible. I could have gone to Missouri School for the Deaf, but they looked there and they didn't find it to be supportive enough. They looked at Kansas School for the Deaf and didn't think that would be the best fit for me either. They looked at Kansas City School District in the Missouri side and decided that that wouldn't be the best fit for me either. So my family actually ended up moving in Kansas City to the Kansas side of Kansas City. And I went to a program that was mixed using both sign language and spoken English, and I was in the signing portion of the deaf program at my school. And for anyone else who's lived through that time in deaf education, we know that deaf students who were oral were considered to be smarter than deaf students who use sign language. That was the attitude. That wasn't overtly stated ever within deaf education, but functionally that was the attitude. And the placement of students back at the time in my school, that was very obvious. Deaf students who could use spoken English had a better chance of success. They were considered more intelligent and more apt for academic rigor than students who use sign language. But I was in the signing portion of the program. And I am very grateful for my experience with that group of students. We were a diverse group, and I learned a lot from them, even as a child. We were all very different people. We came from very different backgrounds. Some people were white and poor, some people were Black and lived downtown. There were a couple other people like me who were white, middle class, with well-educated parents, but there were only a couple of us. And the school where I went also had an important impact on me in another way. Most of the other deaf students had parents who were hearing in the working class. So when I spent time with my friends, one thing that may seem odd today is that one of my friends became a teacher for the deaf many years later. Another one of my friends found a job working for a company related to accessibility, CART, uh, relays, phone, and text type of accessibility equipment. Another one of my friends doesn't work in a field related to deafness, but works with children who have illnesses and has a very positive outlook on those. And just, I remember back then being a child with my friends. And I realized at that time, even as a child, that they were all very smart. And I don't keep in touch with them anymore, unfortunately, but I do still think of them fondly. Now, for middle school, for that school district, and I don't know about this system being very prevalent in North America, but in my school, deaf and hard of hearing students were in a program in elementary school, and then in middle school and high school. But in middle school, we were in a different area. We were physically separated into different areas. So most children from the neighborhood were in one area, but then deaf students and other children from other districts were placed in a different area. So I was actually fairly close to where my house was. And again, I lived in a fairly upper middle class neighborhood. But that school was in a different part of town, and I had a different relationship with everyone there. It was a great school, and I was with other very smart kids, but I didn't have very good friends. I missed my friends from elementary school, and the quality of friendship that I had in middle school was different than that of elementary school. After that, I went to high school, and my parents wanted me to start looking for a job. When I was almost 16, I thought I'd see if I could find a job close to home. There was a McDonald's close to home. So I started working at McDonald's. And that job was one of the best job experiences I've ever had. That helped me gain a better understanding of people's diversity and literacy. What I saw and my experiences in that job had a huge impact on me. When I started working there, I did not realize that I was probably the most educated person working there, even though I was still in high school. And that was a big shift for me. That mindset was very different. I grew up with that unspoken attitude around me that deaf students don't have good English, deaf students aren't as smart or as well educated as everyone else. I had that mindset from the systems and the structures that I was raised in. That's a whole other topic of discussion again. But working at McDonald's and interacting with the other staff and the customers there, most of the staff, first of all, were from the city, where I lived in the suburbs, even though it was not far from the city, but it was not far from my neighborhood either. I met one boy who I loved. He was so funny. He was such a good-hearted man, and we had such good conversations with each other and a good relationship. But I found out that he worked two jobs. He had children. He had to work two full-time jobs. He worked two full shifts every day. He almost never got to see his children. And at that time, I learned that, and I knew already that that wasn't right. So we wrote back and forth. And I was raised with that societal brainwashing that deaf people's literacy skills is not that good. Reading and writing is not that good. And mine was all right, but still I had that attitude that my reading and writing was not that good. I always thought that I would write a note to him, and then he would write something beautiful and eloquent back. But what always happened, and what shocked me the first time, when I saw his note, I had to revisit my beliefs and my assumptions about other people. I saw the issues in the educational system, the deeply rooted issues in our educational system related to poverty and related to all of these other factors. There were so many things that I realized while I worked there at McDonald's. I worked there for almost 2 years, and it was such a good experience. And I always encourage people to work in that type of job to get a better understanding of society and everyone within society. So I was in high school, I was getting close to graduating high school, and I had that attitude of wanting to get out of the US. I wanted something new, I wanted something different. So I applied to see if I could visit another institution in Europe. And sure enough, I was accepted to a deaf school in Norway. And that study abroad experience was fascinating. That also began the realization for me that I was a linguist. Before that, I knew that I liked language. I would always ask my parents about English and about why all of these different rules applied to English. And I always enjoyed talking with my parents. My parents were very good linguistics teachers, I have to admit. But then I went to the deaf school in Norway and started learning from them and interacting with them and learning Norwegian Sign Language, how it was different from ASL, how it was similar to ASL, and that was really a light bulb moment for me. Their lives in Norway were also very different from my life in the US, and that gave me an opportunity to compare our experiences. And that was the beginning of my fascination with sign language research. Even though I wasn't even in college yet, I became fascinated with it at that time. Now, at that time, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. That was my passion. And I went into college for my first year at Wellesley College. I took a heavy course load in biology, chemistry, all of the pre-med track type of classes, and I realized that it was not for me. My advisor at one point sat me down and said, "So, I'm looking at your grades, and your grades are pretty awful." My advisor suggested that I find something a bit more light and a bit more fun. And I said, "No, I'm on a pre-med track. I want to be a doctor. This is my passion. I want to be a doctor." And my advisor told me to stop, to cut it out. My advisor told me to try art or something a bit more light. So after I left that meeting with my advisor, the next day or maybe a few days after, I happened to run into a few friends who already knew sign language. It happened that they had worked close to the Vermont School for the Deaf before it closed. So it happened that they knew sign language already. And I was talking with them and saying that my advisor told me that I need to take lighter classes, that I can't continue in this pre-med track, and I really wasn't sure what to do about it. And they said, "You have to take Intro to Linguistics." I said, "What's that? Intro to Linguistics?" I had no idea what linguistics was. And they said, "No, trust me, you will enjoy it. The professor's great. You have to take this Intro to Linguistics class." I admit I was very resistant at the time.
So, in the fall semester, I took this linguistics class, and I am not a morning person, but I made myself get out of bed each morning to go to this class. Ooh, it was a lot of work to pay attention. It was difficult for me to understand what was being communicated. Now, I could understand this subconsciously, what the teacher was saying, but it was still difficult at the same time. My grade in that class was not great. I think I had some C's. My test scores were not good in that class, but I always, I had a passing grade. But it was a lot of work for me. Now, again, my advisor told me to take art, so I took a drawing class, but hold that for a bit later. So I took this linguistics class, really enjoyed it. My professor was Andrea Levitt at Wellesley College. They do not have a linguistics department. It's really called language studies. Many students would go to MIT to take that class, this specific class, but I didn't want to do that. And I found out that I could take a course in linguistics with a 1-year study abroad component. In Norway, at the University of Bergen, they had one program that I was able to do, and Wellesley College paid for my interpreter for that experience for me. I was very grateful to them for that. But this was a linguistics study program for 1 year in Norway. I valued the diversity of students and professors and perspectives. They were amazing teachers. I learned so very much from this experience. Everything was so visual and so easy for me to understand. Even phonology, I was able to understand easily. It was almost like a game for me. And it's not really about hearing and sounds, but it's a system that you have to understand the parts of. Now, I realize that I am a horrible test taker, and that has been a problem at a variety of times. But when I sit down to take a test, my mind doesn't seem to want to work with me. Anyway, for my degree requirements, I had to take other linguistics courses like childhood language acquisition, and other courses. After I finished the required linguistics courses for my program, at this time, actually, I had taken 18th and 19th century architecture course with a friend of mine. And one day we were talking about what we would be doing after we got our degrees and finished college, and I knew that I didn't want to work yet. I wanted to go for more schooling, more education, and my friend asked me where and which program, and I told them that I wasn't really sure, but I did seem to enjoy linguistics and language. So my friend said, "Oh, okay, so you picked a program. You want to do linguistics. So tell me more. Where?" And so I said that there are 2 universities that I am looking at. One is University of New Mexico and one is Gallaudet. I think there was a third college I was looking at, but those 2 specifically are what I remember. Now, my friend, who was a woman and hearing and did not sign at all, she responded to me, "UNM, University of New Mexico, why? Tell me why." And I explained my reasons. But she said, "Yes, but why? Tell me why." I explained, it's a good program. And then she said, "Okay, wait, no, tell me Gallaudet. Why would you go to Gallaudet?" And I explained the different parts of the program or reasons why. And she kept trying to get me to tell more about why I would pick one program for it versus another. And she said that I probably should go to Gallaudet because I had been so long without a deaf community around me that I should go to Gallaudet to get that experience and that socialization. Now, this woman was a good friend of mine, but I remember how much that impacted me. She actually made a really good point that I had not thought about. There's a difference between a good linguistics program and getting a good social experience while in your doctorate program. Now, I was accepted at both universities, UNM and Gallaudet, and I decided to go to Gallaudet for my master's program. It was a good experience. I enjoyed it. I'm glad I did it. But what was most important about my experience at Gallaudet for me, and maybe some of you are similar, but at that time, we had a cultural language colloquium. I remember I started in the fall of 1999. I think a couple of years after I started, they closed that program, the colloquium. They stopped doing that, but they were still running this program when I began. So the summer of 99, they offered a 3-week course, which was more of a condensed exposure and acquisition program for mostly hearing students to learn deaf culture and sign language. Then there was a separate program for those who were already fluent in ASL and involved in the deaf community, and you could choose a different language. So Italian Sign Language is the program I chose to be in. And a friend of mine with a group of students went to Rome to do some research, or I found out a friend of mine had gone to Rome to do some research there. I developed a relationship with the student and several others that were in this program. At this time, Gallaudet also had the Fulbright program that you could apply for and study abroad. And so I did this, and I was told by Paolo that often Americans were not accepted to this program, but that I had a chance because Paolo had worked at this program in Rome and he was known there and he could put in a good word. So I actually was accepted to this program in Rome. But I want to talk about the concept of collaboration. The NCR program was an interesting experience. That year, I say that I sat in the deaf room, myself and Paolo and Barbara Pinazzi. None of us had a university degree at this time. Their knowledge and their experience and their insights about language and deaf people opened my eyes to a whole new world. The three of us would get together every day and we would talk into the night every day and learn so much from each other. I learned how we carry forward new ideas or past ideas and how we adjust them and help them to grow as we go along. Sometimes when we're having conversations with others, we might realize our idea might not be so great because of the discussions that we have and the thoughts that come about and the reframing that can happen through these conversations with other people. You have to learn how to accept positive, constructive criticism and learn how to accept what you should accept, and also learn how to resolve the issues that might arise. And this can happen in large part by working with other people. So when I come to collaborate with new people, I have this experience from Europe, as well as my experiences in the United States and Canada. And oh, I now see why this keeps happening. Okay. So, the group from Italy, the year that I was in this program, I think it was 2002, we worked on a variety of different projects during that year. But Elena Pizzuto was in this program with me, and after I finished the program, asked what I planned to do afterwards, and I told her I wasn't quite sure yet. I knew that I needed to get a Ph.D. I needed to go to graduate school, so I told her that's what I was planning to do. So, I decided that might be what I do, but for her, if I I was young, I was a bit free-spirited at the time. So, and I Peter mentioned that we had met some years ago, and that was through VL2, the Visual Learning Visual Language Center. VL2. I get it backwards. I think it's a long name. But anyway, VL2. Jill asked me to join VL2 and do a project related to showing a word to a deaf person to see if it activates the same place in the brain as it does seeing an English word afterwards. So, Jill Morford was involved in this project, pulled me in, and one of the first and I functioned more as a graduate research assistant. I did go visit Agnes Vilwalk and Rich Bailey in their labs. The three of us came together to talk about a new component of this project that Jill had begun. I think I had just returned from a large VL2 meeting. I'm not sure what they call them exactly, but anyways, a site visit. So this gathering for VL2, I remember getting back from that, and I remember walking in to Rich's office, and he was very hard at work. And I said, I still don't understand why we do this, and this. More technical issues, really, that I was asking about. So I was trying to explain what I was not understanding, and Rich just watched me explain. And it was a strange experience for me because now in Italy, I I lived, ate, and slept in a deaf world, really, in that deaf room that I spoke about earlier. Now, and the work was very compartmentalized. we each had our own part or piece of the project that we were to work on. I'm not sure if you know the quote, the 12 blind men and the elephant. So I only see one part and you only see one part and another person only sees one part, and none of us see everything as a whole to get the full picture. And that's what Jill's So I realized that I was trying to figure out why each of us were doing different parts and trying to put all the different parts into one. And I was unable to do that. Even though Jill had the big picture, I did not. Now, I did get that experience with Agnes. Well, it's a little bit different because Agnes lived with me at that time too. But anyway, so my experience working with Jill was that I have to adjust. And I have to bring people together that are on the team to discuss our project and how we plan to move forward and who has what role. And no, I am not going in chronological order here, but back to fall of 2003 at the University of New Mexico. So I don't know why the linguistics program accepted this as Vera John Steiner was my teacher, my professor, and this person was a trailblazer in creative psychology and wrote many books with several different researchers. But I remember this classroom and this room full of individuals from a variety of majors, educators, business administrators, all variety of majors. And I was the single linguist in the class. Now, Vera John Steiner, she published a book right before I took her class, but she discussed 3 types of creative collaboration. And I want you to, we were to think of how these 3 pieces could apply to the field of linguistics. So the first section is compartmentalized work. Everyone has their part, and then you pull them all together and get the final product. We often see this type of work happening in the scientific fields. Everyone's tasks are delegated and specific. Now, the second you know the artist Picasso. I'm sure you're familiar with Picasso, but I'm not sure if you know how he learned his trade and became famous. Before he moved to Paris, early in his career, he was working in a studio and ran into a famous artist somehow. And ran into the artist Basque. And Basque asked Picasso if he could come to his studio and look over his work. And Picasso agreed. He said, "You come and look at my work, give some feedback, criticize it, Then I will come and take a look at your work, do your critical analysis, and then we can come back and discuss. You need to read the book. But anyways, she discusses this example really great. But anyway, so they looked at each other's work. They never touched it. Never touched a brush to it. They thought about all the changes that they considered could be made to improve the artwork. They discussed their techniques, their creativity, etc. So Picasso, through that experience, improved his techniques and then moved to Paris.
And then the last type of collaboration, a good example of that is Sylvia Plath's husband, I believe was her editor. His name might have been Tom Hughes, but I'm not sure exactly. So Sylvia Plath, of course, has all of these ideas, all of this creativity, all of these notes about her writing and everything, and writes everything down, creates this huge draft of a book, and then hands it over to her editor, Tom. The editor goes through it and makes everything work together, makes any edits that are needed, creates cohesion in it, and then gives it back to Sylvia as a final product. So Vera discussed these three types of collaboration. And I've always kept that in mind, ever since I took that class. In linguistics work, and especially in sign language communities, we always have to come back to why. And we need to have a better discussion about how we view signers, whether or not they're deaf or hearing signers. If you work in linguistics documentation or description, if you work in psycholinguistics, if you work in anything related to language, it's very important that we view our relationship with the language community that we're working with. I think today we often don't have enough serious critical discussion about how we do that and about how we work with and within the language communities that we study. In my work, there are still ASL linguistics teachers. I still have linguistics ASL teachers, people that I can sit down with and learn a lot from, people who teach me new things. Just think about it. Do I have access to all possible signing communities? No, of course not. I only have access to this one tiny part of the signing community that I'm part of. And they have a certain view and a certain experience, but there's so many different views and different experiences and different signing communities everywhere. And we need to make our work more welcoming. We need to make more welcoming spaces for these language communities. And we need to claim, or even better to say reclaim, the ability to share ideas and to share credit and to recognize. Even though people may not have a university degree, on paper they may not have the quote unquote appropriate qualifications that are required, we need to recognize the wealth of knowledge that they can bring and the value of their experiences. I've worked with many different people in many different places around the world, and I am always committed to sitting and listening, to trying to learn from them as much as I possibly can. I want to share their ideas with other people as well. It's not an easy thing to do. It's very difficult to listen to people and absorb and then pass on their knowledge. We are embedded in systems. Those systems control us and sometimes create barriers in our work. And that type of collaboration with language teachers and with students can be language teachers as well. We need to think about how students can enter into spaces and be in spaces where they have a sense of recognition of their ideas and where they can bring different ideas and different thoughts into the work. That's something that I'm committed to, is building that type of environment. That's something that I've been committed to for a very long time. This topic has come up again and again everywhere I go. And I don't want to limit this discussion to be a deaf or a hearing thing. It's not about that. Hearing non-signers compared to hearing signers, compared to deaf signers, compared to deaf non-signers, compared to deaf people who have speaking privilege and use sign language, compared to deaf people of deaf families, it just becomes too much. There are too many variables and too many factors, and it becomes too confusing. All of them are valid. All of their experiences are valid. But we need to be completely open to everyone else in the community. We need to see the big picture. We need to see the largest picture we can. And we have to give more recognition to language users and language teachers. We have to work together to encourage and facilitate that type of collaboration. I want to say that I've been mostly involved in positive collaboration experiences. Today, in my projects, I see myself and my role in them, but it's not always the same. My role in one project might be different than my role in another project. How I interact with projects is different from project to project. But one thing that is constant is that I want people who see me and people who know me to know that if there is a label that would stick to me, I'm the idea person. I love ideas. I love brainstorming. I love throwing out different ideas. And I admit that some of my ideas are not what they could be. I accept that. I listen to criticism. And I appreciate my colleagues who are willing to say, well, here's the thing, and give me advice about when my ideas might not work. I'm very open to that. Because my ideas are flexible. My ideas can change. My ideas can be replaced by a different idea. That's not a problem at all. I think the most important thing is that we see the big picture. So many of my colleagues are very detail-oriented. And now, remember I said I wanted to come back to that art class? I hate art. I hate art, but remember my advisor forced me to take the art class. That was also a prerequisite for everything else that I had to take. I tried so hard to get around it. I tried to get an exception. I tried not to take this art class, and I had to take the art class. I suffered through it. So there were a lot of different art practices that were covered in that class, but I want to cover two things specifically related to this class. The first thing is that we were trained in the practice of using pencils. So fine line type of drawing. I don't remember it very well. Obviously, it certainly didn't stick with me, but the idea of using pencils to create pencil drawings, line drawings. I looked around at other students and theirs were beautiful. They were incredible. I was so impressed by the amazing skilled artists in the class that I took. And then I remember another activity that we had to do with chalk. We had a big chalkboard that we had to use. And Wellesley has a beautiful tropic greenhouse on the grounds. It's very famous, but anyway. So I found a place with my chalkboard to sit in the greenhouse, and we had to make a chalk drawing very quickly. And we were all practicing this. So I did a chalk drawing of some sort of tropical plant. And everyone is drawing, I made my drawing, and then the professor came over and said, wow, this is very good. I thought that was strange, but I moved to a different one. And again, this is art class. So I did a different chalk drawing, and that was the moment it hit me. What I like to do is take a very long view, a very rough view. I like getting the gist of something. I like sensing the energy and the overall vibe of something. I'm not a detail-oriented person. Instead, I like seeing the whole big picture. I like understanding how everything works together. And that understanding, that light bulb moment that I had, is something that has stuck with me since then and that I apply to my work. I'm a big picture person. I like thinking very broadly. I like taking a very broad perspective on the field of linguistics. There is theory, of course, but also sign language communities. I like looking broadly and thinking big about sign language communities, how they all fit together, how cognitive functioning theory and psychological models are applied to language, how language develops and changes, how the brain works, how cognitive processes work, especially in deaf children. And deaf children, we know, might not have the same experience as a hearing child because of that auditory input or lack thereof. And what happens cognitively in the brain for deaf children? What types of communities are there, and what are the variations between the communities? For me, I'm interested in seeing how everything fits together. I'm most interested in language variation. I'm fascinated by anthropology and sociology, especially when it's applied to deaf people. And in some ways, they are not that same. They are not that similar. But in some ways, the qualities could be similar. But I like looking at the bigger questions and the bigger picture of our research.